Thank you everyone for joining our webinar today. I'm delighted to be joined by Chris Snyder, who's going to take us through some thoughts around resilience and asset protection, and in particular how insurance plays a role in that. I'm going to let Chris introduce himself in a minute, but just before we start, just to let you know that we are recording this session, so it will be available later. It's usually about 4 or 5 days, and then we make it available on the IAM knowledge library. If you would like to ask questions, we are picking up questions through Slido, and that enables you to be able to vote up questions, etc., etc. So it's a really great way of capturing all the questions. So the code is #8341999, and I've just put that in the chat as well. So please do pop your questions into Slido, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end to ask Chris some great questions you'll come up with during the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Chris and let Chris introduce himself, and just wanted to say a massive thank you on behalf of the IAM, Chris, for agreeing to do this presentation. Thank you.
Not a problem. Thanks, Ursula. So my name is Chris Snyder. I'm coming to you from just outside of Toronto in Canada, for those who are overseas. I have been in the insurance industry in a position what we refer to as a risk engineer, risk control, working for two major global insurance carriers, and currently over the last year and a half have had my own consulting business. What is a risk engineer? For those of you who might not know, we are the group of individuals with a variety of knowledge and skill set related to insurance risk. We go out to current and prospective insurance customers. We visit their locations. We assess a variety of types of risks such as exposure to fire, liability, product liability, fleet management, marine, machinery breakdown, equipment breakdown, quantify the risk for the underwriter, who then subsequently, excuse me, uses that information to help determine the premiums and the capacity for the insurance policy. And then we continue to work with the customer on improving the risk. So hopefully you'll be able to see the integration between our insurance risk management programs and risk assessment programs and how they tie into other risk programs such as ERM and, of course, asset management. So the first thing I want to try to talk about is when you're looking at a holistic ERM approach, insurance does play a part in a lot of different areas. When we're talking about operational risk, we pretty much cover all of the operational risk. This is where we're looking at anything from business interruption to interdependencies, the potential for loss of revenue, all the way up to loss of physical assets, the building, the equipment within inside the building, as well as any natural hazard or severe weather events that can cause damage to any of the physical assets that might be on property or across a group of properties, depending on the event. We do touch on some people risks, such as liability and product liability, product recall. And we also talk about strategic risk. We touch on strategic risk, such as intellectual property and other areas, and market risk, where it's related to business interruption and supply chain, about the geographical spread of that risk, as well as maintaining or regaining market share. The one thing that I would indicate, and it's something that I would speak to all my customers about, is that you need to have a good, robust understanding of your insurance program for your organization in any type of risk management process. If you do not have that information, then you are missing out in various ways of transferring risk to the insurance company. How can you know what risk to transfer to the insurance company if you don't know what insurance package your company has and under what conditions the policy might be triggered? What are the limitations? What are the limits? Are we being insured for cash value of our equipment or replacement costs? So you definitely need to have that insurance piece in. It's an integral part of the whole risk transfer and risk mitigation process. What I'm going to do, just simply because I don't know everybody's background and their understanding of insurance, I'm going to go through some basic insurance pieces about coverage and start talking about things such as hard market and soft market to get a general understanding of how insurance is working on the commercial side. And hopefully you'll be able to see the integration into asset management. But obviously there'll be Q&A and you can always relate some of your own questions and we can bring it back to some of this insurance information. So, firstly, most insurance that you see out there today in a commercial setting is your typical property insurance program, which is covering your physical location or locations, the equipment within inside the locations that are part of either your process or your operation. So it can be racking, it can be chargers for forklifts, it can be equipment used to produce a product. We refer to your property policy as PD or property damage, and it also typically includes business interruption. So this is a loss of revenue from a physical damage loss that occurs at one of your locations, but also can impact maybe a sister facility with interdependencies and has what's referred to as extra expenses in some markets. And that's normally a volume of money at the disposal of the customer to immediately access and start throwing at a loss in order to recover faster. And of course, in a typical property policy, you most likely will have your natural hazard exposure, such as flood, wind, whether it's hurricane, typhoon, tornado, as well as lightning and some other different types of perils, subsidence and damage to the building due to earthquakes and the liquefaction of the soil. Some added coverages that you can put on that are very common would be contingent business interruption, which is your first tier upstream and downstream. You can look to grab insurance on one of your suppliers or one of your customers. So if they have a physical damage loss that interrupts your ability to get your product or service out or receive materials that you're going to use in any type of a fabrication process, if you've named them in the policy, then you can be compensated for the loss of that supplier, that customer. And supply chain, of course, is a big one that has evolved over the last couple of years. It's very difficult to find a true supply chain insurance product. Most of the time, it's contingent business interruption with just some added features. But if you do find a true supply chain insurance product, it does cover additional perils that wouldn't be covered under contingent BI. A couple other different types of coverage that can come in and we would be looking at from a risk insurance perspective. Ordinary payroll, being able to pay the salary of some of your key employees. You might have an operation where these employees are very hard to find and take a long time to train. And if you have a loss, you want to make sure they're not running off to a competitor so you can cover their payroll. Extended indemnity period allows you to purchase coverage that might be caused by the need for a longer ramp up period after a loss. There are some quirks with that. There's an ability to write business interruption on gross profits and gross earnings. Gross earnings is Japan and the United States. Gross profit is pretty much the rest of the globe. Gross earnings, if your policy's on gross earnings, you will typically find extended indemnity purchase there. The difference between the two with gross earnings, as soon as you've rebuilt your facility, got all of your assets back in place, and you're ready to start producing if you're a manufacturer, the policy ends and that ramp up to the pre-loss level is not covered. You have to buy that extended indemnity. Whereas on gross profits, if you haven't reached your indemnity period, say a year after the loss, as you start ramping up your production in this scenario, you're still covered until you either get to 100% or the indemnity period is reached. So there's just some slight differences. And of course, another coverage that you might find, depending on where you are in the world, is fine arts and historical property. So obviously, fine arts, it's hard to quantify a replacement of fine arts, as well as historical property. If they receive a loss from that asset, it does take a little bit more to rebuild because you're trying to preserve what is left of that historical property and build around it. And then lastly, I mentioned two other coverages here that you would probably find typical. You've got your liability and your product liability. Product liability is